I'll always think of Leah as my first love. It just wasn't meant to be. It didn't seem fair to either one of us. I was going off to college halfway across the country. Even at that age, I knew long-distance relationships just didn't work. There may have been a small amount of selfishness involved in my decision, but I assumed Leah would be fine. I put it off as long as I could. With just a week left, I broke the news, and it didn't go well. I spent the entire night trying to convince her that it was for the best, but she never fully seemed to accept it, and things would just get messier from there on. I left that Friday and put that part of my life behind me. Classes kept me busy during the week, but I also worked hard to make friends. Meeting new people isn't hard when you live in the dorms. I was there maybe a month when I met Stacy. She was a sophomore living on the floor above me. We had a lot in common and began dating exclusively almost immediately. This was also about the time the letters started. It was like she knew that I'd met someone and wanted to destroy it. From then on, a week didn't pass without a letter from Leah. I read them and sometimes wrote back in the beginning, but they all began to sound the same after a point. When I returned home for Christmas, she showed up unannounced. She couldn't understand why I had stopped answering the letters. I had explained it over and over. The relationship was done, and it was past time to move on. I felt like I was speaking to a wall at that point. Not a single word got through to her, and I reached my boiling point. I told her to go away and never bother me again. I left her alone on that porch to cry herself out, and she finally left at around 4 a.m. I felt bad for doing things that way, but I just wanted it all to be over. If it took being cruel, so be it. She'd be better off in the long run, and the remainder of my holiday was quiet. I returned to school with a positive outlook and a renewed vigor. It finally appeared my Leah problem was solved, but instead, she escalated things to an entirely new level. Everything came to a head one night in my dorm room. Stacy and I were watching a movie with the lights off. There may have been a little light petting going on. I was occupied when Stacy started yelling. I looked up to see her pointing at the window. Through a small crack in the blinds, I could see a pair of eyes looking in. I grabbed the string and pulled the blinds up. Leah was standing there with a shocked look on her face. I called campus security without saying a word to her. She ran off, but was caught trying to get away a few minutes later. I was determined to end it right there and then. I intended to press charges and get a restraining order against her, and I urged Stacy to do the same. And to her credit, she came up with a better and less complex idea. When security asked what I wanted to do, I put it into Leah's hands. I promised I would take no further action if she promised to leave that second and never contact me or Stacy ever again. It was a big risk, but I was willing to take it. I guess there was still that small part of myself that felt guilty for the breakup. She reluctantly agreed, and the officers allowed her to leave. To be honest, I never expected her to keep the agreement. Nonetheless, it's been 9 years, and I've received no visits, texts, or phone calls from her. There was one short sympathy letter that she sent upon the death of my grandfather. I was so comforted by that thought that I just let it pass. I can't speak as to whether or not Stacy has heard anything, but I suspect that she's had the same experience. I did return home to work in my dad's company after college and have seen Leah around town on occasion, and we just do our best to avoid each other. I've been told in the intervening years that she is married and began a family, and I wish her all the luck in the world and hope the marriage proves to be a very long and happy one. Back in the spring of 2018, I was living in a cramped Brooklyn apartment with my best friend in the entire world. We'd each moved to New York City around the same time, two country girls feeling way out of our depth in the big city, and struck up an instant connection once we'd heard each other's accents in a coffee shop. She'd grown up in Kentucky while I was literally just over the state line in West Virginia, and we'd each had a very similar rural upbringing. On top of that, we had a similar sense of humor, similar tastes, and we just clicked. Yet there was one major difference between us. Kayla had been sad to leave her little town behind. She'd been sad to leave her family, sad to leave her friends. The Big Apple was calling her all right, but she still pined for home. But for me, I didn't miss home one bit, and my family is about as messed up as they come. But it's not really their fault. I guess they're responsible for their actions and all, but we suffered a family tragedy when I was a kid, and it really took its toll. Either way, meeting her was an absolute blessing, but as much as we enjoyed each other's company, we started pining for some more masculine company, if you catch my drift. And since talking to strangers in NYC is the fastest way to end up bound and gagged in someone's basement, we decided to try dating apps on for size. Honestly, I found Tinder and Hinge to be a little overwhelming, but my roommate had much more luck with an app called Bumble. Basically, the premise is that the girls talk first, giving them much more control over their interactions with the guys they match with. So, it was little surprise that she landed a very promising-looking guy before I did. He was handsome, well-read, and he was also from the South, but he'd said he'd moved around an awful lot during his childhood, so he didn't consider himself from any one particular place. All in all, he sounded like a nice guy, and after a few dates, my roommate brought him back to our apartment on the night that I happened to be awake. I was excited to meet him, but even more excited for my roommate to start spending nights at his place too, since I got the whole apartment to myself. And in New York City, solitude is a luxury that very few get to enjoy. Anyway, so it's Friday night. I'm sitting on the couch watching Netflix and demolishing some Pepperidge Farm when I hear my roommate's key in the door. In she walks with her date in tow. We make some introductions and a casual but friendly conversation begins. Only the more we talk, the more I realize there's something oddly familiar about my roommate's Bumble date. And unfortunately, this is where my story needs to take a little tangent. See, my 10-year-old brother was murdered, and his killer was someone our whole family knew. I was just 6 years old when Mom and Dad took me over to stay with my grandpa. They told me it would just be one night, and 3 days later, they finally showed up again to tell me that Ryan wouldn't be coming home, and that he'd have gone to live in heaven with Grandma. I'd already suffered through the loss of my grandmother, but at that age, I think death was still a very abstract concept to me. I didn't grasp the permanence of it, or even what it really meant. It sucked that I couldn't see Gam Gam anymore, but at the same time, it just felt like she and Ryan were in the next room over. Not gone, just not visible. I was sad about it, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it really affected me until much later on, when I actually learned about the circumstances surrounding Ryan's death. I don't remember exactly when I learned about it, but I know it made me really angry and sad to think that the reason I couldn't see Ryan anymore was because someone had hurt him. It made it even worse that the person that had hurt him was supposed to be one of his friends. The little tidbit was like the salt in the wound. Like I knew the kid. I'd seen him and my brother hanging out on a number of different occasions. So when somebody mentioned that it was Troy Arnold that had killed Ryan, I became fixated on him, wondering how such a gangly mess of stick-thin limbs and scruffy dark hair could be capable of causing my family such pain. I remember his eyes, too, how they were so dark brown that they looked more inky black than anything else. And it was those eyes that featured heavily in the nightmares for a long time. But not until I actually found out how and why he'd killed my brother. According to Troy's confession, he and Ryan had been out playing by some train tracks one afternoon. Troy had found an old railroad fish plate, obviously tossed on the side of the tracks by some careless engineer. The thing must have weighed about 22 pounds, but all Troy said was that it felt really heavy in his hand. He and Ryan then walked down the train tracks a little ways until Ryan stopped to tie his laces. Troy said he just stared at the top of Ryan's head for a second, and started to wonder what it would sound like if he hit him with the fish plate. So, he hit him, and Ryan started shaking something awful. Troy knew he'd be in trouble for what he'd done, so he decided to try and hide it. He bashed Ryan's head with the iron fish plate until he stopped moving. Now look, I've had time to think it over, and I do actually understand why he did the first part. Kids are dumb, cruel, and thoughtless, so it makes sense he'd take the coward's route in that respect. But what I don't understand is what he did next. When confronted by the cops, Troy said that all the other wounds on Ryan's body were the result of him being dragged to the shallow grave that he dug for him. Ryan was dragged for no more than 100 yards, but somehow, during the course of that short journey, his dead body sustained some of the following damage. It appeared an attempt had been made to cut Ryan's tongue out. Both of his eyes were missing from their sockets. Fingers were missing, as they'd been ripped off at the joint. More than one piece of debris had been inserted into Ryan's rectal cavity. There was catastrophic damage done to his private areas, as if they'd been repeatedly smashed in an attempt to pulverize them. And some of that info didn't trickle down to me in a clinical fashion. No. All I heard were rumors, some of which weren't all that far off from the truth. In the end, Troy Arnold was sent away to juvie in some other state, and since he was so young when he killed my brother, the federal government gave him a brand new identity at age 18, so he could go out into the world as quite literally a different person. The nightmares continued for years after, and the more I knew regarding Ryan's death, the more intense they got. It got to the point where I kept dreaming that Troy Arnold would come for me too. He'd gotten one sibling, now it was time to get the other. Since the only thing I really remembered about Troy was how black his eyes were and how scruffy his hair was, those became the central features of this monster my mind had created, until there came a time when the nightmares would simply be of some tuft of dark hair with glistening eyes staring out from it. Which brings me back to my chance meeting with my roommate's Bumble date. Because as good-looking as he was, something about the color of his eyes and the way he carried himself, it brought me back some seriously horrible memories. Not that I said anything, of course. Not at first, anyway. But the longer we talked, the more I started to piece together who exactly we were talking to. He was reluctant to talk about family, and any attempt to pin down something about his formative years was quite succinctly evaded. When he mentioned something traumatic happening during his youth, I almost snapped. But then I started to get this weird, crushing feeling in my gut, something I couldn't quite pin down until one horrible moment of realization. It happened the moment I mentioned growing up in West Virginia. The Bumble date guy shot me this look, this distinctly guilty look, and what had once been a friendly conversation turned into an impromptu staring competition. My roommate was like, "What's going on?" But her question was accompanied by an awkward giggle. She could obviously pick up the tension. She just didn't know why it was so thick in the air all of a sudden. "Troy?" I remember asking. The word just sort of left my mouth before I could think about the implications, like the whole thing was a completely involuntary act. Jesus Christ. The way he looked at me afterward with those black-brown irises that seemed to take up his entire eye. It was him. My brother's murderer was sitting right in front of me. My nightmares had come to visit. "I should go," he said, as he began to walk out, and the words just wouldn't come to me. I sat there dumbfounded while my roommate was all like, "Hey, whoa, what just happened here? Your name isn't Troy? Who's Troy? Where are you going? What just happened?" I managed to catch him right before he walked out the door, and all I could bring myself to say was like, "Don't come back." What followed was a complete reliving of something I tried so hard to get over. Obviously, I had to tell my roommate everything, and I mean everything, so she could actually understand A, what had just happened, and B, why I'd had such a strong reaction to it. The thing that got at me first was the sheer improbability of it. Of all the apartments in all the cities in all the world, it seemed like a cosmic joke directed right at me. One designed by a cruel universe to undo all the progress I'd made. But my roommate helped me rationalize it. I mean, New York City is the place to go if you want to be anonymous, right? Of all the places where a person could just blend into a crowd, NYC had to top the list. She was a real help, and support she showed during the fallout from the chance encounter had only further solidified what an incredible friendship we had, and still have to this day. And if there's one takeaway from the whole online dating thing to be taken from this, is that you never know who you're talking to. I could give you some story about how they're the second coming of Christ, but it's all just a ruse. All just an attempt to scrub the blood from their hands. Blood that will always be there, no matter how much they try to be rid of it. First of all, let me say this is not an indictment of OnlyFans. If someone wants to profit from sharing pictures of themselves or their body, that's totally their right, and I respect that. I'm not casting judgments on anyone who chooses to do so. But let me be clear, OnlyFans just about ruined my life, and I've never even set up a profile. It all kicked off not long after I broke up with a guy I'd been dating for about 3 to 4 months. As a single mom, it's way harder to get dates than I'd like it to be, but at the same time, I totally understand why someone wouldn't want to raise a child that isn't theirs. I mean, I wish more guys would be open to it. It's not like I'd never have a kid with them too, but it's just a sad fact that it puts guys off when you've got a child from a prior relationship. So you can imagine how excited I was when I met Richard. It's not his real name, but I'd rather not attract his attention, thank you very much. Having a 6-year-old son didn't seem to bother him in the least bit, and he even asked a lot of questions about him. I found the whole thing so refreshing and mature that by the time Richard asked me out, I just about bit his arm off accepting the invite. But then the first red flag appeared when he started making comments about my son, calling him Daddy. That wasn't the red flag in and of itself, it was more his reactions when I told him, no, my son has a dad and I don't want him confused as he grows up. Richard didn't seem to respect that position whatsoever and actually said some quite personal things regarding my taste in men, as well as the integrity of my son's father. It's a complicated situation, I'll concede that, but Richard's take on the whole thing was frankly disgusting and misogynistic. But given that it was a very unusual setup, I didn't want to give up on him so quickly, not since guys like him seem to be so hard to come by. But then, after 2 months of clashing, not often I should add, I had to face the music and accept that if there was a guy out there for me, it certainly wasn't him. I've dated guys for 18 months who took the breakup better than Richard. They're always rough, but I think if I actually told you what Richard did, you'd think that I was making this all up. Needless to say, his reaction totally justified my decisions to end things. End things, and that's exactly how I phrased it too. But that breakup was far from the end of my ordeal with Richard. And you know what? It's kind of my fault too. In fact, it's mostly my fault, because if I hadn't been so trusting, I wouldn't even be writing this right now. The one big mistake I made was trusting Richard to keep private certain pictures I'd sent him. I think I trusted him because, well, he sent me pictures of him too. I think that's why there's a lot less nude leaks than there are nudes. It's like Americans and the Russians in the 80s, mutually assured destruction. You release mine, well, I'll release yours. But after we broke up, I deleted all of his intimate pictures, and I was foolish enough to think that he'd also done the same. Because the next thing I know, I got a message from a friend of mine saying something like, "Oh, you have an OnlyFans. You go, girl." I had to ask her what OnlyFans was. I literally had no idea at the time. She replies like, "You're joking, right? Was this supposed to be a secret?" Immediately, I start Googling OnlyFans, and as you can imagine, I'm pretty shocked at what I see. The whole website is basically homemade lewd images, and for those that aren't familiar, and from what I could gather, the girls in question make quite a lot of money too. I mean, I wouldn't say no to an extra $2,000 a month, but I hadn't set up a profile, had I? I asked my friend to send me anything she's found with my name on it, then what do you know? There's a freaking OnlyFans profile set up in my name, and the whole preview picture in the banner was a raunchy picture that I'd sent to Richard. The profile said like, free to subscribe, so I made a dummy user account to sign up, only to discover that Richard must have uploaded about 10 different pictures I'd sent to him, all with these disgusting captions that I'd rather not repeat here. I was angry, so angry. But I didn't get scared until I saw that he'd put up my home address. My actual home address, apartment number, postcode, everything. It kicked in how much danger I was in. and I just burst into tears thinking that my own selfish actions had exposed my only son to danger. I know it was all Richard, and I know if he was just normal, then yeah, it wouldn't have happened. But I'm a mother. I should know better. I'm not some attention-seeking teenager anymore. I just wanted to feel wanted, though. Surely people can understand that. In the end, I managed to get the profile taken down, and I think OnlyFans and other sites like that now make you verify your identity so stuff like that can't happen again. But what if you manage to get a hold of a girl's ID or something? The system they have doesn't completely eliminate the chance of fake profiles being set up. Like I said at the start, I don't mean to judge anyone who wants to do that kind of thing. I just hope they have their safety and security in mind because, as I think we all know, there are some serious psychos out there. I had an exceptionally upsetting incident on my third job house sitting. To help you understand why it affected me so much, I should probably tell you about myself. I grew up in a single-parent home. My mom has always been a loving and understanding parent, but I think she felt pressure to find a new husband. My dad left us soon after I was born. She began dating almost immediately. This pressure caused her to make a lot of bad choices. She did the bar scene, constantly bringing home a new man. A few would stay, but not for long. She never seemed to understand that you don't find a husband in a place like that. Every relationship inevitably broke down into arguments and fighting, and on more than one occasion, the fights got physical on both sides. My mom's love of wine did a lot to inflame tensions. And because of this constant state of chaos, I became a people pleaser and hated confrontation. It's the big reason behind my panic attacks. I've worked a lot on my assertiveness, but I sometimes fall back into my old habits. My story starts in 2015. I was bouncing from job to job. I've been having a hard time finding something in my degree field. A friend had recently become a house sitter and made it sound fun. She made it sound like a permanent vacation, and I desperately needed one of those. She gave me a quick course on the ins and outs of the job and helped me land my first client. I was a ball of nerves, but I got through it. The second client went much smoother. It would be the third that would make me think twice about doing this long term. It was now mid-2016. I answered an ad asking for someone to sit a house a few hours away. This would be my first long-distance gig, and I didn't want to mess it up. I made a list of questions and showed them to my friend. She suggested a few changes, and I called the number. The homeowner and I made an appointment for me to view the property. I quickly made arrangements and drove up to meet him. He was a businessman, needing to leave town on short notice. My job would be to accept packages and mail, but most importantly, look after his dog. The dog's name was Bart. He was a St. Bernard mix, and when we first met, he didn't appear very interested in anything. He sniffed me once and returned to his bed. It all seemed simple enough. I asked a few questions, and at the end of the appointment, we both decided that I'd be perfect for the job. I checked into my hotel for the night and returned the following morning. My stay would be for 3 full nights, and I was looking forward to relaxing and maybe even playing with Bart. That afternoon, I tried to do just that. Bart wasn't interested, though. Instead, we lounged together on the patio. It was a beautiful sunny day. The slow, cool breeze in the shade made it feel like paradise. The home's slightly remote location allowed for a wonderfully peaceful environment. I felt calmer than I had in a very long time. Bart and I took a brief nap before going back inside for dinner. I ordered a pizza and cheesy bread. Afterwards, I opened a pint of ice cream I bought for such an occasion and parked my butt in front of the television. Bart was proving to be just as easy to handle as I'd hoped. He joined me on the couch and we watched a movie on Netflix. We had completed a little less than half of it before the doorbell began ringing. This wasn't your normal ringing, however. The person was pushing the button over and over again. It was now well after 5 p.m. and I wasn't aware of anyone visiting that late. I did briefly consider not answering it, but the incessant ringing made me think someone may need help. The woman I encountered on the opposite side of the door had very aggressive body language. I didn't say one word before she tore into me. She demanded to speak to the homeowner. I told her he was out of town on business. It didn't seem wise to let her know when he was to return. She didn't appear to believe me. As she spoke, she grew louder and became visibly angrier. I could feel myself getting increasingly nervous, and I did all I could to convince her. Then, she began cursing at me, calling me all these things and terrible words I'd rather not repeat here. She had convinced herself that I was the homeowner's new girlfriend. I hadn't noticed until just then, but Bart had walked up behind me. As he became more enraged, he grew more aggressive. The scene quickly became a cacophony of yelling and barking. I could feel a panic attack was on the way. I was completely overwhelmed by all of it. Bart's booming bark echoed through the hallway. It looked like he would attack her at any moment. And things would only get worse from here. I'm not sure what I said, but it set the woman off, and she lunged at me. Bart reacted by lunging at her. By some miracle, I was able to get the door closed before anyone was hurt. After that, Bart calmed down a bit. He backed away a few feet and sat down, but his eyes stayed glued to the door. I slid down the door and commenced to suffering one of the worst panic attacks I've ever experienced. The woman continued screaming and pounding on the door, and I was sure that I was dying. To his credit, Bart stayed where he was and did nothing. And minutes passed and I was able to get enough control of myself to call the police. The operator did a fantastic job of talking me down. The police arrived and I made it clear that she attempted to assault me. The officers were understanding and took the woman away with them. I'm not sure if he was formally arrested, however. I was still very shaken. I was a heartbeat away from running back home. In any matter, I had to notify the homeowner of what had happened. He was extremely apologetic and begged me not to leave, but against my better judgment, I agreed to stay. Like I said, I tend toward being a people pleaser. Admittedly, leaving Bart alone after he tried to protect me would have been cruel. We finally agreed that my fee would be doubled. It did feel like extortion, and I knew it may affect my reputation, but I'd already decided this would be my last sitting job, so I accepted. I'd need all the money I could get until I found a new job anyway. The next 2 nights were calm and quiet. Bart stayed by my side the entire time. It made leaving that much harder. The homeowner and I had a brief conversation the morning he returned. He was still very apologetic and explained what may have caused the situation. He and the crazy woman had been dating, but he ended it because of her suspicious and controlling behavior. I didn't inquire any further. I got the impression he was very embarrassed by her. I'd already been paid, so nothing was keeping me around any longer, except for Bart. I bent down and gave my hero a big hug and kiss on the nose. I could already feel the tears welling up. I didn't want to make a scene of myself, so I said goodbye and jogged away to my car. That was the worst and the last of my brief career in house sitting. I don't miss it for a second, and as for Bart, that's a completely different story.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.